So, in November of 1506, Alonso Manso, who was the very first bishop of Puerto Rico, he sits down to write this letter of really urgent concern.
Right, right. In the earliest, most chaotic days of the colony.
Exactly. And the thing is, he wasn't writing about the massive hurricanes sweeping through the Caribbean or the gold mines or, the indigenous populations. He wasn't even writing about the massive logistical nightmare of just keeping this new colonial settlement alive on the edge of the world.
No, he had his sights on something very specific.
Yeah, he was writing about ships, specifically Portuguese ships. In this official state correspondence, he flat out says that these Portuguese vessels are arriving in port carrying merchants that the church absolutely needs to keep a very close, highly suspicious watch on. And his reason, which he literally writes out in ink, is because, quote, above all, they are Jews.
Which is, I mean, it's just a startling historical contradiction when you read those words today.
It really is.
Because on the surface, it feels like a total non sequitur. I mean, why would a Spanish Catholic bishop stationed in this totally remote Caribbean outpost in the early 16th century look at a Portuguese merchant stepping off a Portuguese ship and just reflexively automatically see a Jewish heretic?
And that question right there is the core mission of our deep dive today. We are going to decode, I think, one of the most brilliant, most dangerous, and incredibly resilient linguistic survival tactics in the entire history of the Atlantic world.
It's an amazing topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
We are unpacking the euphemism of La Nación Portuguesa, the Portuguese nation. We're going to dig into the sources and explore how this really simple, seemingly totally neutral geographic nationality was transformed into this highly understood, thinly veiled code word for a banned religion.
Because for, well, nearly 3 centuries, throughout the entire expanse of the Spanish Empire, calling someone Portuguese, it wasn't just, a statement about where they were born or what language they spoke. It was an incredibly heavy-loaded synonym. It meant Judeo-converso. It meant crypto-Jew. This was a word that literally carried the absolute weight of life and death. An entire hidden identity packed into one geographic label.
So for you listening, I really want you to think about this as an exploration of how language behaves under the ultimate pressure. Like, what actually happens to everyday vocabulary when speaking the truth about who you are is literally a death sentence.
Right. How does a perfectly innocuous label become a shield?
Exactly. The ultimate shield for a family's survival, and not just for a couple of years, but across multiple generations. We are looking at this linguistic shadow that fell all the way across the Atlantic, landing specifically in the rugged mountains of colonial Puerto Rico. But to understand why Bishop Manso looked at a Portuguese sailor in 1506 and immediately saw a hidden Jew, we actually have to rewind exactly 14 years from that letter.
We have to go back to the 1490s.
Right, the pivotal decade of the 1490s in the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah, you truly cannot understand the power of this euphemism without understanding the catastrophic human displacement that made it necessary in the first place.
Set the scene for us.
So the crucial year is 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella issue the Alhambra Decree, which formally and absolutely expels all practicing Jews from Spain, period.
And this isn't some slow, gentle transition.
Oh, not at all. It is a massive tectonic demographic shift. We're talking about tens of thousands of families forced to just liquidate everything, selling their assets at rock-bottom prices, packing whatever they can physically carry, and completely abandoning homes that their ancestors had lived in for centuries.
Unimaginable.
And the immediate terrifying question for these families is, well, where do we go? And the closest, most logical destination for roughly 100,000 of them was simply to cross the western border into Portugal.
Which, geographically, that makes total sense. If you're fleeing a hostile state on foot or by cart, you've got your kids, your elderly parents, you just head to the nearest adjacent border, you cross into Portugal.
Exactly. And King João II of Portugal allowed them to cross that border. But we definitely shouldn't view this as some act of pure humanitarian benevolence.
Right. There's always an angle.
Always. He saw an economic opportunity, so he charged them this very heavy per capita tax just for temporary residency. It was super lucrative for the Portuguese crown, at least in the short term.
But it didn't last.
No, this temporary refuge was incredibly short-lived, because just 5 years later, in 1497, the whole geopolitical landscape of the peninsula shifts again. Portugal's new monarch, King Manuel I, finds himself backed into a really severe political corner by the Spanish crown.
Wait, what was the leverage? Why does Spain even care what Portugal is doing with these refugees 5 years after kicking them out?
The leverage was a royal marriage. King Manuel desperately wants to marry the Spanish Infanta Isabella of Aragon. This marriage is just absolutely essential for his political and dynastic ambitions. It's his potential path to eventually uniting the whole Iberian Peninsula under his bloodline.
Okay, so he needs this marriage to happen.
Right, but the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, they are zealous in their religious purification. So they issue this strict ultimatum to Manuel. They say, if you want to marry our daughter, you have to align with Spanish policy. You have to completely rid Portugal of its Jewish population.
Because Spain basically doesn't want a haven for Judaism sitting right on its porous western border.
Exactly. But this is the catch. If Manuel is being cornered by Spain with this ultimatum, and Spain just proved that mass expulsion is entirely possible, why didn't Manuel just do the exact same thing?
Yeah, why not just issue his own expulsion decree and send them packing?
Because to expel them would be to just economically gut his own kingdom, and he knew it. The Jewish population in Portugal had just swelled by 100,000 highly educated, deeply connected people fleeing Spain. They represented an immense, totally irreplaceable source of economic power.
Wow, okay, so it's a massive brain drain if they leave.
Exactly. These were the merchants managing the international trade, the administrators balancing the royal ledgers, the cartographers mapping out all those new maritime routes to India, the physicians, the artisans. If he kicks them out, yeah, he fulfills his promise to Spain, but he destroys the engine of his own empire.
I'm trying to conceptualize how you navigate a trap like that. It feels somewhat like a massive hostile corporate buyout.
Right.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. Like, Manuel has this entire totally vital workforce. He can't fire them because the company would instantly collapse. But the new board of directors in Spain is demanding that their specific department be entirely eliminated.
Yeah.
So instead of firing them, you just, I don't know, force them to change their job titles and their uniforms literally overnight.
That corporate buyout analogy is actually brilliant. It perfectly describes the mechanics of what he did. Manuel's solution to this impossible dilemma wasn't expulsion. It was far more radical and honestly far more traumatic. He ordered a systematic, forced mass conversion. He didn't give them a deadline to leave. He actually ordered the ports closed. Tens of thousands of Portuguese Jews were rounded up, physically prevented from boarding ships to leave the country, dragged to baptismal fonts, and legally, forcibly declared Catholics.
Literally overnight.
Overnight.
Yeah.
By royal decree, they all became new Christians. Or in Portuguese, cristãos novos.
So they are forced to adopt this totally new identity under the threat of absolute state violence. But they're expected to just wake up the next morning and perform the exact same essential functions for the Portuguese economy.
Precisely.
They're still the merchants, they're still the cartographers, still the scientists, but now they are wearing this new mandatory label of new Christian.
The economic engine didn't stop. It was just violently rebranded.
Right.
But, this overnight rebranding created a highly unique demographic reality that ended up echoing for centuries.
How so?
Well, because of this specific 1497 decree in Portugal, almost every single person of Jewish heritage in the entire Iberian world now had a direct, inescapable tie to Portugal.
Oh, right. Because whether they were native Portuguese Jews or Spanish Jews who had fled across the border back in 1492, their history and their actual physical survival were now entirely inextricably linked to the Portuguese state.
Exactly, which fundamentally changes how the Spanish authorities view anything or anyone coming out of Portugal.
Yeah, it has to.
To the Spanish mind, the Portuguese border basically became a contagion zone. It was the gateway through which crypto-Judaism, secret hidden Judaism practiced behind closed doors by people who were officially baptized Catholics, flowed back into Castile and eventually out into the Spanish colonies.
Because Spain had officially expelled its Jews in 1492. So theoretically, there should be 0 Jews anywhere in the vast Spanish Empire.
Theoretically, yes.
But Portugal hadn't expelled theirs. They had just painted over them with forced baptisms. So the sudden presence of a quote-unquote Portuguese merchant anywhere in Spanish territory immediately raises all the alarms.
It triggers an absolute automatic suspicion of religious heresy.
Okay, so you have 100,000 people forcibly rebranded overnight. A generation later, they're moving around, conducting trade, trying to survive. How do the Spanish authorities actually write that down in their tax books without breaking their own laws?
That's the bureaucratic nightmare right there.
Right. They need a way to identify this incredibly specific demographic, but they can't openly write down Jew because Judaism is technically illegal, and these people hold legal Catholic baptismal records.
This is exactly where the anatomy of the code word begins to solidify into something institutional. If you look at the sources in the official imperial registries, in mercantile tax records, and crucially, in the instructional manuals used by the Spanish Inquisition itself, we start to see very specific overlapping euphemisms appear.
Like what?
Well, you rarely ever see the word Jew. Instead, you see phrases like gente de la nación, meaning people of the nation,
Okay.
or hombres de la nación portuguesa, men of the Portuguese nation, and sometimes simply Portugueses de la nación.
The nation. It sounds so, I don't know, incredibly broad. Like if someone today said they were of the nation, could literally mean absolutely anything. Yet in this specific historical context, it was surgically specific.
It was. And to really grasp it, we have to contrast it with how the majority population was categorized. Think about how a Catholic merchant of, say, old Visigothic Spanish blood was recorded in these exact same colonial ledgers.
Wait, let me stop you there for a second. When you say old Visigothic Spanish blood, you're talking about the concept of limpieza de sangre, right? The blood purity laws.
Yes, exactly.
Did they actually have laws based on who your ancestors were hundreds of years ago, like legally enforceable laws?
Oh, they absolutely did. Limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, became an absolute obsession in the Spanish Empire. It was a deeply racialized legal framework. If you wanted a position in the government or in the church, or even just in certain trade guilds, you had to mathematically prove that your ancestry was free from any Jewish or Muslim taint going back generations.
That is wild.
The ideal was to trace your lineage all the way back to the Visigoths, the ancient Christian rulers of the peninsula, before the Moorish conquest in the 700s.
Yeah.
So if you were a merchant with that clean, unquestioned lineage, the clerk recording your cargo at the port would simply write down Español or Castellano.
No qualifiers at all, just Spanish.
Right, just Spanish. But if you were recorded with the addendum de la Nación Portuguesa, or even just de la Nación, it was this widely recognized whisper. It was basically an invisible asterisk next to your name in the ledger.
Wow.
It signaled to literally everyone reading that document.
Yeah.
This person is a new Christian, a converso, and almost certainly a practicing crypto Jew.
And our sources show this code wasn't just some localized Iberian quirk that stayed in Madrid or Lisbon. This euphemism went international. It became an open secret all the way across the Atlantic and throughout Europe.
It was everywhere.
Like in French port cities, places like Bayonne and Bordeaux, crypto Jews were living, operating businesses, and trading under the legal, perfectly recognized status of Portuguese merchants. The French port authorities knew exactly who they were. They knew what religion they practiced in private, but they tolerated them legally under this euphemism because of the immense economic wealth they brought to the docks.
It functioned as a mutually beneficial legal fiction. By formally calling them Portuguese merchants on official French state documents, the host countries didn't have to confront the uncomfortable religious issue of officially harboring heretics, which, would really anger the Pope.
Right.
But they still got to keep the lucrative international trade networks flowing right into their harbors.
Okay, hold on. I'm stuck on this one point. If everyone knows what Portuguese really means, if the dock workers in San Juan know it, if the French port authorities in Bordeaux know it, if a fearsome Inquisition agent in Cartagena knows it, why doesn't a Spanish governor just look at the ledger, see the word Portuguese, and arrest them on the spot?
It seems obvious, right?
Yeah. Like, how is a secret coded useful as a survival tactic if literally everyone knows the code?
That is the essential paradox of this entire history. The answer lies in bureaucratic, plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
Yes. It provided a crucial, paper-thin layer of legal distance. As long as you were officially recorded as a Portuguese Catholic with a valid stamped baptismal certificate, the local governors, the port officials, and your trading partners, who, by the way, desperately needed the manufactured goods, the sugar, and the enslaved laborers you were importing, they could do business with you.
Ah, I see.
They could interact with you without risking excommunication from the church or being charged with treason against the crown for conspiring with heretics. It allowed the gears of an empire to just keep turning while everyone politely agreed not to look too closely at the private lives of the merchants who were turning those gears.
It's state-sanctioned blindness. They just need the goods more than they need the religious purity, as long as the paperwork gives them a solid alibi.
Yeah.
But this localized open secret, this really delicate balance of winks and nods, it was about to be blown wide open thanks to a massive geopolitical shift at the end of the 16th century.
Right. In 1581, the political boundaries of the world effectively shifted overnight. We see the union of the crowns. King Philip II of Spain successfully claims the throne of Portugal, basically uniting the two global empires under a single monarchy.
which changes everything.
For the crypto-Jewish population, the immediate practical consequence of this union is profound. The hard borders between the Portuguese Empire and the vast, incredibly wealthy Spanish Empire entirely dissolve.
It's a physical reality, right? The checkpoints come down, the trade embargoes vanish. You suddenly have this massive influx of Portuguese merchants, seasoned sailors, agricultural technicians, and traders just pouring out of Lisbon and flooding directly into the previously restricted Spanish Americas.
A total flood.
And everywhere they go, setting up shop in Cartagena, in Lima, in Veracruz, they carry this linguistic code, Nación Portuguesa, right along with them.
Because they finally had legal, unrestricted access to the silver-rich markets of the New World, which for nearly a century had been violently restricted to Spanish subjects. But because they were now technically subjects to the exact same United Crown under Philip II, it became legally impossible for local Spanish governors to just keep them out of ports in the Caribbean and South America.
The historical irony here is just staggering to think about.
Isn't it?
Here you have the Spanish crown, an institution that expended vast, almost unimaginable resources, trying to ruthlessly purge its empire of Judaism through the terrors of the Inquisition. And by orchestrating this geopolitical merger with Portugal to expand their own power, the Spanish crown inadvertently created the exact bureaucratic loophole that allowed crypto-Jews to legally establish themselves across the entirety of the Americas.
They essentially built the very bridge their targets needed to escape.
Right. It is perhaps one of the greatest examples of unintended consequences in colonial history.
It really is. But we have to remember the reality on the ground. Even with the borders open and the paperwork technically valid, the Spanish Americas were not inherently safe. The Inquisition was not staying behind in Madrid.
Oh.
The Holy Office was establishing terrifying, highly active tribunals in major colonial centers like Lima, Mexico City, and Cartagena. So as this Portuguese diaspora flooded into the Americas, they couldn't simply settle down in the capital cities and openly run markets.
Right, they'd be right under the nose of the Inquisition.
Exactly. So if you are trying to disappear, where do you go? You look for the one place Madrid is completely ignoring. You need a place on the absolute fringes of the empire, where the gaze of the Inquisitor doesn't reach.
Which brings us to the perfect Sephardic haven, Puerto Rico.
Yes. But to understand why Puerto Rico became a sanctuary, you really have to strip away our modern understanding of the island.
Okay, what did it look like back then?
Puerto Rico, in the 16th and 17th centuries, was entirely different from the bustling metropolitan hub we think of today. It was a heavily militarized but chronically neglected imperial outpost.
Why was it so neglected, though? I mean, if it's a major island in the Caribbean, wouldn't Spain want to aggressively develop it?
You'd think so. But the Spanish crown was entirely obsessed with the mainland continents. All of their wealth, their attention, their military protection, and their administrative power was laser-focused on extracting the unimaginable wealth of the silver mines in Mexico and Peru.
Ah, right. The silver.
Puerto Rico produced no precious metals. None. Its primary function was strategic. It was just the first port of call for the treasure fleets entering the Caribbean, acting as a military buffer against the English and the Dutch. Because of this, it was left severely underfunded, desperately underpopulated, and deeply, deeply isolated from the everyday flow of imperial commerce.
So the Spanish crown is basically saying, we only care about the fortress in San Juan protecting the bay. We aren't sending supply ships. We aren't sending investment. Just hold the fort.
Exactly that.
And for a crypto-Jew fleeing the active tribunals in Lima or Seville, that exact isolation was a lifeline.
Absolute lifeline. Survival depended almost entirely on your physical and bureaucratic distance from the center of imperial power. If you arrived in Puerto Rico and stayed in the coastal capital of San Juan, you were still dealing with the royal governor, the military garrison, the official tax collectors, and the watchful gaze of the local clergy.
Too much heat.
Way too much heat. But the geography of Puerto Rico offered a brilliant alternative just a few miles inland.
The Cordillera Central, the dense central mountain range of the island.
Yes. If a settler moved just slightly inland, past the stone walls of the military garrison in San Juan, and up into the rugged, humid, nearly impassable mountains of the Cordillera Central, they became essentially invisible to the state.
Wow.
Up in those mountains, the roads were practically non-existent. There were no bishops checking to see what kind of meat was served on your dinner table. There were no inquisitorial spies watching your windows to see if you were secretly lighting candles on a Friday night.
It's like hiding in the forgotten back room of the Spanish Empire. You aren't surviving by actively fighting the empire. You are surviving by moving to the exact geographic location the empire doesn't care enough to closely manage.
That's a great way to frame it.
But at the same time, the empire desperately needs that back room populated to maintain its territorial claims. Because if Puerto Rico is totally empty, the British or the Dutch will just sail in and take it. It's this incredibly delicate balance of mutual need and intentional neglect.
That balance was maintained entirely by necessity.
Yeah.
But, getting to Puerto Rico and making the trek up into the Cordillera Central, that was really only half the battle. The truly fascinating question is the daily reality of their lives.
Right.
Once they were there, once they were actually living in this forgotten back room, how do they utilize that Portuguese euphemism to hide in plain sight among the local Catholic population?
Let's break down the mechanics of this survival. Because they didn't just, show up on a pristine royal Spanish galleon and happily announce their arrival to the governor. Our sources highlight that they usually arrived on Portuguese ships that were heavily engaged in illegal contraband trade.
We really have to touch on the economic reality of the era here, specifically Spanish mercantilism. The Spanish crown had incredibly strict mercantilist laws. They dictated that a Spanish colony like Puerto Rico could only legally trade with authorized Spanish ships coming directly from Seville.
Okay.
Buying or selling anything to foreign powers like the Dutch, the French, or the English was strictly illegal. It was considered smuggling. But because Spain neglected Puerto Rico and rarely actually sent those authorized supply ships, the island was literally starving for manufactured goods.
So they couldn't survive without contraband trade.
Exactly.
So basically, the Spanish crown was saying, you can only buy from us, but then they weren't sending any supplies. So if you wanted flour or tools to run a sugar mill or even just clothing, you had to break the law and buy from smugglers.
That is precisely the situation. And these Portuguese merchants were perfectly positioned to fill that void. They were sailing in on the absolute margins of the law, bringing in essential agricultural goods, heavy sugar mill machinery, textiles, and enslaved people. They were fulfilling a completely vital economic need through illicit, shadowy networks that were deeply tied to openly Sephardic Jewish communities in places like Amsterdam and Curacao.
Okay, so they arrive as an absolute economic necessity, bringing the goods the island desperately needs to survive. But they still have to navigate the social and legal landscape of a Spanish Catholic colony once they actually step off the boat.
Right, they can't just operate openly.
And to do this, they utilized what we can conceptualize as a dual-layered armor of identity. The first layer is entirely on paper. When asked who they are presenting clean, officially sealed Catholic baptismal records.
And in a highly bureaucratic empire like Spain's, the document is truth. If the paper says you are a baptized Catholic, the local official basically has to accept it unless proven otherwise.
But our sources note that these documents were very often purchased on the black market, or just outright forged back in Lisbon or Seville before they ever even crossed the Atlantic. How does one even forge a 16th century baptismal record? We aren't exactly talking about Photoshop here.
No, it was a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched black market. You had entire networks of sympathetic or honestly simply corrupt scribes and lower-level priests in major Iberian port cities.
Okay.
For the right price in silver, a scribe would literally scrape the ink off an older, legitimate parish registry book using a pumice stone and write your new Christianized name right over the erasure.
Unbelievable.
Or they would forge the official seals of rural parishes that had supposedly recently burned down, making the records completely impossible to verify. It was expensive, it was highly dangerous, but it was the absolute prerequisite for boarding a ship to the Americas.
So the paperwork had to be impeccable, and they paid a massive premium to ensure it was. But paper only goes so far when you actually have to live shoulder to shoulder with other people in a colonial settlement. You can't just, hand your neighbor your baptismal certificate every time you do something unusual.
Right, and that is exactly where the second layer comes in, the linguistic armor. In their daily interactions, they fully, completely adopted the public designation of being de la Nación Portuguesa. And this euphemism was brilliant, because it functioned as an impenetrable catch-all explanation for literally any cultural difference.
Right. It explained away everything that might otherwise raise a local priest's or an inquisitor's eyebrow.
Everything.
Why do these newcomers have distinct accents when they speak Spanish? Why are their family mercantile businesses so incredibly tight-knit, secretive, and completely closed off to outside investors? Why do they seem to only marry within their own specific circles of fellow Portuguese families? Why do they categorically refuse to eat pork in a culture where pork is an absolute staple of the diet?
If you, as an outsider, asked any of those perfectly reasonable questions, the answer provided by their neighbors, their business partners, and the merchants themselves was always the exact same nonchalant shrug. Son de la Nación, they're Portuguese, they just have their own peculiar ways.
It's remarkable that geographic nationality becomes a completely acceptable proxy for the banned religion. The local authorities just accept all of these strange cultural quirks as regional foreign differences rather than heretical religious practices.
Because it neutralized the threat. To be a heretic was a crime against God and the crown, punishable by being burned at the stake. To be a quirky foreigner with strange dietary habits was just an annoyance.
Yeah.
The euphemism downgraded their behavior from treason to eccentricity.
There is this incredible, vivid piece of source evidence from the archives that brings this exact dynamic to life so perfectly. It's a trial record from the year 1642 involving a wealthy merchant residing in San Juan. In the inquisitorial records, a witness is brought forward to testify under oath against the accused merchant. And the witness notes on the official record two specific things: that the accused religiously washed his hands before every prayer, and that he completely rested from all labor on the Sabbath on Saturday.
Now, to anyone with even a rudimentary theological training in the 17th century, those are glaringly obvious, undeniable Jewish practices. Washing hands before prayer is a staple of Jewish ritual purity, and resting on Saturday rather than Sunday is the defining marker of the Jewish Sabbath.
But crucially, the witness didn't call them Jewish practices. When asked by the court why the merchant behaved this way, the witness testified that this was simply the custom of those of his nation.
That specific phrasing is everything. The custom of his nation, not the custom of the Jews. By framing it exactly that way, the witness, whether they were intentionally covering for a friend to save his life or genuinely believed the euphemism after hearing it for so long, provides an incredibly powerful legal buffer.
It legally shifts the behavior from a religious crime, which the Inquisition must forcefully punish with fire, to a national quirk, which the local governor can simply choose to ignore.
It is a linguistic shield of plausible deniability operating in a real courtroom. And for decades, it worked brilliantly. It allowed them to build complex lives, establish vast trade networks, intermarry, and survive.
But of course, plausible deniability only works until the most feared, powerful institution in the entire empire decides it's time to stop looking the other way.
Exactly. The shadow of the Inquisition eventually stretched even to the forgotten backrooms of the Caribbean. Now, to understand how this worked mechanically, Puerto Rico didn't actually have its own permanent inquisitorial palace. There was no grand, terrifying building of the Holy Office dominating the main plaza, like you would find in Lima or Mexico City. Instead, the island fell into the vast, sprawling jurisdiction of the Tribunal of Cartagena, located in modern-day Colombia, hundreds of miles across the sea.
So how did they effectively police the religious thoughts of an island population from all the way across the Caribbean Sea?
They managed it through a terrifying system of delegation and surprise visits. The Tribunal of Cartagena would periodically send an inquisidor visitador, a visiting, traveling inquisitor, to tour the islands.
That sounds ominous.
Oh, these visits were rare, but they were catastrophic when they happened. Suddenly, an official with absolute power would arrive in port, demand all the ledgers, and begin interviewing neighbors. And when a visitador wasn't present, the tribunal would appoint local, everyday parish priests in Puerto Rico to act as their commissarios, or commissioners.
Wow.
These local priests were given the extra duty of ferreting out heretical depravity on behalf of the Holy Office in their own backyards.
And here is where we see the tragic double-edged sword of the euphemism. Because for decades, introducing yourself as a Portuguese of the nation helped crypto-Jews identify one another in a dangerous world. It helped them build immense trust across these illicit, globe-spanning Atlantic trade networks. It was like their secret handshake.
Yeah.
But the moment the Inquisition officially turned its focused gaze to the Caribbean, that exact same linguistic code provided the Holy Office with a pre-made, highly organized, easily searchable target list.
This shift happens violently during the era of the Great Conspiracy Trials in the 1630s and 1640s. During this period, the Inquisition actively sought to entirely dismantle the commercial networks of Portuguese New Christians across the Americas, largely because they suspected them of aiding the Dutch in their wars against Spain.
Ah, so politics and religion mixing again.
Always. If you look at the internal, private correspondence of the inquisitors from this period, the terms Portuguese and Judaizers are no longer coded. They aren't winking at each other anymore. The words are used completely interchangeably. To search for one was to arrest the other.
The archival instructions sent from the tribunal in Cartagena to the local commissioners in San Juan are genuinely chilling to read. I want to share the exact quote from the sources because it shows exactly how the state finally cracked the code. The Holy Office ordered the local priests to, quote, "Diligent search out all those who are of the Portuguese nation. Observe if they perform the rites of the law of Moses under the guise of their national customs."
Under the guise of their national customs.
Exactly. The Inquisition is explicitly stating in writing that the jig is up. They know the geographic nationality is a mag for the banned religion.
Right.
They're instructing their local agents to look past the euphemism, to stop accepting they just have peculiar ways as an excuse, and to start arresting people. But this raises a really dark question about how this code was weaponized once the state cracked it. If the local authorities now know that Portuguese is completely synonymous with secret Jew, and if these Portuguese merchants are the ones controlling a massive, highly lucrative portion of the vital contraband trade, didn't this linguistic shortcut make it incredibly easy for corrupt colonial governors to just steal from them?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if you are a greedy official, you don't even need to go through the effort of catching a merchant praying in Hebrew behind closed doors. You just label them Portuguese of the nation, declare them a suspected heretic, arrest them, and confiscate their entire cargo regardless of what they actually practice in private.
That is exactly the nightmare scenario that unfolded. The euphemism became a blunt tool for extortion, blackmail, and state-sponsored theft. The label Portuguese became so incredibly toxic during these specific crackdowns that it could ruin a family simply by association.
That's terrifying.
It was a terrifying reality. If you were a successful, wealthy merchant operating openly on the coast, your wealth made you an incredibly tempting target, and your label made you legally vulnerable to asset seizure. You were basically a walking piggy bank for a corrupt governor.
So to escape this targeted, state-sanctioned harassment on the coasts, these families had to make a choice. They retreat even further. They abandon their businesses in San Juan and the coastal trading hubs, and they push deeper and deeper into the rugged interior mountains of the island.
They had to hide.
And as they do this, as they isolate themselves further from the imperial center and integrate with the rural population over generations, we see something deeply fascinating happen to the language itself. Their formal, legal euphemism begins to warp, degrade, and transform into deeply ingrained local slang.
We can trace this evolution of slang most clearly in western Puerto Rico, in areas around towns like San Germán and Mayagüez. Because of their geographic proximity to the Mona Passage, these western ports were absolute hotbeds for smuggling, particularly with the Dutch operating out of Curaçao. The Portuguese families who retreated and settled there eventually became incredibly influential in the local rural economy. They owned the isolated sugar plantations, they managed the illicit shipping docks hidden in the mangroves, and crucially, they intermarried with local established Catholic elite families to secure a web of social and political protection.
And as they blend into the local fabric, intermarrying and having children who are raised further and further away from the original Jewish traditions, the way the broader community talks about them changes.
Right.
The formal Inquisition in Cartagena is looking for people who are legally defined as de la Nación Portuguesa. But in the mouths of the local rural populace, describing someone who is perhaps overly clever in business, who keeps their family matters strictly to themselves, or who has peculiar household habits, the language shifts. It erodes.
It definitely erodes.
Our sources highlight several specific colloquial derivatives that emerge in the local Puerto Rican vernacular. Instead of the formal title, you start hearing neighbors use phrases like ser del bando portugués, being of the Portuguese faction.
Right, it becomes a colloquialism. You also see the word altered entirely into Portuguese, which becomes a regional demographic marker rather than a strict declaration of European nationality. Or people simply refer to these families as la gente de la otra banda, the people from the other side, or the other coast.
This linguistic erosion mirrors how modern language works so perfectly. We see this all the time today, where a strict, formal, legal definition slowly breaks down over generations of being spoken aloud, until it becomes a piece of shorthand colloquial slang.
Yeah, exactly.
But in the process of that erosion, it permanently embeds historical prejudices and cultural markers of otherness into the everyday speech of a community. A farmer in the 1700s might say a neighboring family is of the Portuguese faction without ever knowing about the Alhambra Decree of 1492 or the forced conversions in Lisbon. The actual history is buried, but the feeling of otherness, the idea that these people are somehow separate from us, remains perfectly preserved in the slang.
Language is essentially an archaeological site. These slang derivatives effectively stripped away the formal, dangerous legal definition of nationality and turned the euphemism into a softer cultural marker. It became a convenient way for the rural society to categorize a group of people who were somehow different, somehow separate, even if the original terrifying religious reason for that separation was no longer consciously understood by the broader community.
So we have this incredible multi-generational survival mechanism. We have this coded language that starts in 1497 under the threat of forced baptism, crosses the Atlantic Ocean, shields entire families in the colonial ports of Puerto Rico, and eventually degrades into mountain slang.
An incredible journey.
But centuries pass, empires wane, the Spanish Empire slowly loses its iron grip on the Americas, and eventually the terrifying machinery of the Inquisition itself finally crumbles into dust. So what happened to the people? What happened to the descendants of those who wore these linguistic masks for 300 years?
To understand the final, perhaps most surprising chapter of this story, we have to look at a very specific legal shift in the year 1815. The Spanish crown, desperate to spur the lagging, isolated Puerto Rican economy, issues the Real Cédula de Gracias, or the Royal Decree of Graces.
Okay, what did that do?
This was a massive economic liberalization measure. And crucially, it legally opened Puerto Rico to non-Spanish Catholics. It allowed merchants, planters, and technicians from all over the Caribbean to settle legally on the island, bringing their capital and their enslaved labor forces with them.
And this decree brings a new wave of openly Sephardic Jews back to the island. Merchants from established open Jewish communities in places like Curaçao, St. Thomas, and Venezuela arrive in Puerto Rico, bringing their businesses, their open faith, and their family names with them.
But the stunning twist of this historical deep dive is what we learn about the original crypto-Jews, the descendants of those families who had been hiding in the Cordillera Central for 300 years.
Right.
When the decree of 1815 was issued, when the Inquisition was effectively toothless and it was finally safe to practice other faiths, these hidden families did not suddenly emerge from the mountains, throw off the Catholic facade, and declare their ancient Jewish faith.
Which is exactly what you might expect. You'd expect a grand revealing, a moment where they say, we survived, the mask can finally come off.
Right, it's the cinematic ending we expect, but it didn't happen. Because over the course of 3 centuries of absolute isolation, fear, and intermarriage, their secret religious identity had completely irrevocably dissolved. It had woven itself inextricably into the very fabric of the rural Puerto Rican Hebrew culture.
For those who might not know, the Hebrew is the traditional, iconic mountain farmer of Puerto Rico. They are the cultural backbone of the island's rural identity.
Exactly. And within that deeply Catholic Hebrew culture, the theology of Judaism was entirely forgotten. They did not know Hebrew. They did not know the Torah. But the physical practices, the daily habits, survived as entirely disconnected family traditions.
The sources outline these extraordinary survivals documented by anthropologists in the 20th century. We are talking about deeply, fiercely Catholic families living in the mountains of Puerto Rico who practice things that make absolutely no sense in a traditional Catholic context.
Right.
Families who inexplicably light candles on Friday nights, hiding them in cupboards. Families who immediately cover all the mirrors in the house with cloth when a relative dies. And my absolute favorite detail, the sweeping of the floors. Anthropologists found women who would strictly sweep the dirt floors of their homes toward the center of the room, gathering the dust in the middle.
Sweeping away from the doors.
Yes, sweeping away from the doors. Now, if you ask them why, they just say, it's what my mother taught me. But the historical root of that practice is profoundly Jewish. They were swooping away from the door frames to avoid disrespecting a mezuzah.
For context, a mezuzah is the small, traditional parchment scroll inscribed with Torah verses that Jewish families affixed to their door frames.
But these Puerto Rican families didn't even have a mezuzah on the door.
And that is the poetry of it. The physical object, the scroll itself, had been gone for 300 years. But the spatial reverence, the physical act of showing respect to the doorframe, remained perfectly intact. They are performing the muscle memory of Judaism.
The muscle memory, wow.
The theology was violently erased by the fires of the Inquisition, but the physical actions were passed down quietly from mother to daughter, father to son, justified simply as the peculiar things our family does. It's an incredible, heartbreaking testament to the resilience of human habit under pressure.
And the surnames. The family names tell the exact same story of survival and assimilation. If you go to the central mountain towns in Puerto Rico today, you find families with names like Mercado, which literally translates to merchant, a very classic converso adoption when they were forced to take new names in 1497.
Yeah, that's a big one.
You find Rivera, Toledo, Teixeira, Portocarrero. These are the enduring, living legacy of the Portuguese nation.
If we pull back and connect this to the overarching historical picture, it brings our entire linguistic theme full circle. In Puerto Rican Spanish, idioms, customs, and names carry history in the exact same way that amber preserves a prehistoric insect.
I love that.
The original phrase, "Él es de la Nación," started as a desperate, highly calculated verbal mask. It was a legal fiction designed to navigate a terrifying world where your true identity was a capital offense. It allowed a persecuted people to survive the fires of the Spanish Inquisition. And in the end, over the span of 3 centuries, the mask was worn for so long and so successfully that it simply became the face. The code word became the reality.
So what does this all mean for us today? The story of the Sephardic Jews, the story of the converso and the crypto Jew hiding in the mountains is not just a footnote in European religious history. It is an explicitly American story. It is a Caribbean story. And it is a deeply foundational, integral part of the Puerto Rican story. It is a testament to the thousands of families who carried an ancient, persecuted heritage hidden securely behind a carefully chosen euphemism, surviving on the beautiful, rugged outskirts of an empire that wanted to erase them.
It forces us to remember that history isn't just something static found in dusty archival ledgers in Seville. It is actively breathing in the colloquialisms we use every day and the family habits we inherit and practice without ever questioning where they came from.
For everyone listening, I want you to consider the idioms, the regional slang, and the polite euphemisms you use in your own language today. What hidden histories of survival, what ancient prejudices or desperate masks might be embedded right there in your everyday vocabulary? How much history are we speaking aloud without even realizing it?
It's a profound thought.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into these sources, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought that really builds on everything we've just discussed. If these families spent hundreds of years perfectly masking their identity to survive the Spanish Empire to the point where their modern, deeply Catholic descendants completely forgot their own origins, what happens today?
I hear you.
What happens when modern commercial DNA testing suddenly reveals to a Puerto Rican family a direct, undeniable genetic link to the Sephardic diaspora of 1492? How does the raw, inescapable data of modern science interact with, and perhaps entirely unravel, the most successful linguistic survival codes of the past? When the undeniable X-ray machine of genetics gets turned on, what happens to the mask of the Portuguese nation?